Hello and welcome to Tech Raven. I'm Nigel and today I'm doing a little video comparing an actual physical hardware drum machine to some drum emulation VST software packages on the computer. So the drum machine that I'm going to be using for this little demo is the Arturia DrumBrute Impact. So the main reason that I wanted to use the Arturia DrumBrute Impact is because this is an analog synthesis based drum machine. So it's kind of similar to the older Roland R8 or TR-626, that kind of thing, where it's just modeled or synthesized drum sounds. So the Arturia, it does have a unique sound because of its analog synthesis based engine. I've basically programmed in just one basic drum beat on the Arturia using the step sequencer, and I've programmed in exactly the same beat using these three drum packages, which is IK Multimedia's MODO Drums and XLN Audio Addictive Drums 2 and Ali James VProm, which is an old Linn LM-1 VST emulation. So it's got the same drum beat that I put in for all three of these and on here. Now what I did with the Arturia, because you can twiddle knobs and you can change pitch, the decay and various other little bits and pieces, and you've got this color controller to change the sound there, I've actually recorded 3 instances of the same beats with slight variations in tuning and sound, just so the kick and the snare and the hi-hat is going to have a slightly different timbre on each of the 3 recordings that I put in. So if you're thinking of buying a drum machine, be it something like this or a Roland TR-6S or TR-8S, or maybe even a second-hand 626 or R8 or something like that, and you've been looking at drum emulation packages like Addictive Drums or Superior Drummer, MODODrum, or machines like the VProm from Ali James, which is a Linn LM-1 emulation, then this video will give you a good idea as to what to expect from all of them. Now, there are pros and cons to using these, so at the end of the video, I'm going to tell you which I prefer and why, and there's definitely, I would say, more disadvantages to using an actual hardware drum machine than advantages. But what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to jump into Logic, I'm going to play through the various tracks that I put together using these 3 drum emulations, and then I'm going to play through the 3 tracks that I've actually DI'd in via my Focusrite audio interface and recorded into Logic as audio files, with a little bit of a synth to give it a bit of flavor and a bass line that I put in too. So I'm going to do that now so you can hear the differences, and then I'm going to come back here and wrap up the video and give you my final thoughts as to why I prefer to use the software packages over an actual hardware drum machine like this. Okay, so I've got Logic open here. So the first thing I'm going to do is explain what's going on with these tracks. So as you can see, I've got 1, 2, 3 instances of the Arturia DrumBrute Impact here. Now, these, as you can see, are all audio files, because what I did was I DI'd the actual physical drum machine directly into my Focusrite Claret 8 Pre audio interface, and that's why these are audio files. I've also got 3 other drum machines here, which are drum emulation software plugins, and at the top I've got a bass line and also a synthesizer, just to give it a bit of color, because just bass and drums would be a little bit boring. So for the synth, I'm basically using AJLab's Oberheim synth plugin. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to check that out. And next, for the bass track, I'm using IK Multimedia's MODO Bass, which is, in my opinion, one of the best bass plugins you can get. Again, I'll leave a link down below if you want to check that out also. And then for the other drum comparisons, I'm using Addictive Drums 2, which I'm a big fan of. I've been using this for a long time. And in here, as you can see, we've got 808 and 909 LinnDrum, Oberheim DMX and Simmons kits. So what I've done is, for this particular kit, I loaded up a 909 kick drum because, let's face it, the Arturia DrumBrute Impact is kind of a synthesizer type drum machine. It's a synth with FM on it as well. So it's got that kind of hip hop type sound, a little bit of 909 thing going on. So I figured I'd use the Addictive Drums real machines to try and get in the same ballpark, if that makes sense. Now, I've also got another drum kit here that I'm going to use as a comparison, and this is another IK Multimedia. MODO Drums, but in this instance, I'm not using electronic, I'm just using a standard acoustic drum kit just so you can hear how that sounds. Again, I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to check that out. And finally, I'm using, again, AJLab. This is the Linn LM-1 drum emulation plugin. This is so good. In fact, all of Prince's band members have actually bought this off Ali James in France. That's how good it is. So I'm going to be throwing that one in there as a comparison as well. So let me just start with the synth. I'm going to solo it on its own and just play it through just so you can hear what this is doing. If I double click on this, you'll see that it's basically just MIDI that I played in via a MIDI keyboard controller. Okay, so that's the synthesizer at the top end. And for the bass, we have this. And then moving on to the first of the, in fact, no, what I'll do is I'll just play a little bit of these other drum tracks first, just so you know what's going on. So starting with the Addictive Drums, let me just solo that. With the Addictive Drums, it's going to sound like this. And then if I solo off the MODO Drums from IK Multimedia, we will have this. And then finally, I'm just going to solo off the Linn V-Prom. Okay, so the Arturia ones, if I just solo those off one at a time, this was the first recording I made. I've got quite a tight kick on this one. Okay, and then the second example, I've changed the tuning of the kick drum and sustained it a little bit more, and I've changed the hi-hats and the snare drum sound as well to come up with a slightly different variation on sound. And then the final example of the Arturia drum machine is this. Now, I've actually gated the kick drum quite long on this one to make it very sort of 909-ish, and I've tightened up and retuned the snare drum and changed the hi-hats by putting the color mode onto the DrumBrute drum machine. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to solo off the first example of the Arturia DrumBrute drum machine with the bass and the synth, so you can hear these three, and then I'm basically going to change the DrumBrute 1 to DrumBrute 2 and DrumBrute 3, and then I'll go through the Addictive Drums, the MODO and the Linn LM-1, just so you can get a comparison between all of them. So this is with the first instance of the actual Arturia DrumBrute physical drum machine. Okay, and then the next example, the second Arturia. And then the third Arturia. And then now I'm going to move on to the Addictive Drums example. And next I'm going to move on to the MODO drums. Now this is the acoustic drum kit, not electronic. And then finally, I'm going to go down to the Linn LM-1 drum machine. Okay, so let me just sort of recap and just quickly go through a couple of bars of each one at a time. So the first, DrumBrute Impact. The second, DrumBrute Impact. The third, DrumBrute Impact. And then Addictive Drums. And then the MODO Drums. And then finally the Linn LM-1. Okay, so I hope that gave you some idea. Those with eagle eyes looking at my stereo, I've probably just noticed that I've got a couple of plugins on here. I've just given very, very subtle reverb, as you can hear, 15%, and it's sort of dialed back, so it's very minimal, just to help glue everything together a little bit there. And I've also got the default Logic built-in mastering assist, just to, you know, boost the bass and mids a little bit, just to, again, help to glue it all together, as it were. So just a couple of bits there. So yeah, I don't know which you thought was the best, but there is no sort of better. There's no winner in this. It's just to basically give you an idea as to what some of the drum emulation plugins like the LM1, the MODO drums, and Addictive Drums sound like compared to an actual drum machine, as it were. Okay, so that's the sound demo out of the way. Now, the reason I prefer to use these software emulations is basically because you've got, you know, if I just double click on this one, it's all based on MIDI. You can just type it all in and you can see the whole thing laid out in front of you. Now, the thing is, I'm not a big fan of samplers or sequencers like the, you know, the Akai or, you know, drum machines like this, or basically anything like the, you know, the Arturia Keystep, stuff like that, that have got sequencers built into them. Because I find that you just kind of get stuck in a loop. Now, with this particular one, it's a 16-step sequencer. So you've got 4, 4, 4, and 4. So basically, you got one bar of 4, 4 time with, you know, 16 semiquavers. And you can extend that to 32, which is going to be 2 bars, or 64. So you can have 1, 2, 3, or 4 bars that you can program in for one sequence. So the longest sequence you can program in is going to be 4 bars. Now, admittedly, you can program in many different sequences and you can knit them all together to make a song. So, for example, you could do, you know, a couple of sequences for the intro. Then you could program maybe another 4 or 5 sequences for the verse, and a couple more for the chorus, and maybe 2 more for the middle 8, and you can, you know, maybe 1 or 2 for the outro, and you can stitch them all together. In fact, many years ago, when I owned a Roland R8, to challenge myself in learning how to program it, I actually programmed in the entire song by Rush, Witch Hunt, from beginning to end, patching together lots of sequences. So it can be done, but it is a little bit of a pain having to do it that way because you've got no visuals. So what you find you do is you're programming in all these sequences and you're memorizing them to, like, you know, patch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then you have to have a bit of paper and you're thinking, right, the intro, it's, you know, sequence number 1 times 1, and then sequence number 2 times 2 for 2 bars of that. And then when it gets to the, you know, the verse, you're thinking, right, it's going to be like 4 times sequence number 4, followed by 2 times, and you have to write it all down. And then when you go to programming it, you just basically type, you know, tapping, and looking at your paper to remember where everything was to get to the end of the song. And the thing with doing that, you'll quite often play the song back, and then you've made a mistake. You've punched in a bar that shouldn't be there. You know, you've maybe added 3 instead of 2, and then you've got to go back and start again. So it's a bit tricky to do that because you've got no visuals. You need a bit of paper. Using Logic, you've still got the sequencer there, but you've got all the MIDI notes mapped out in front of you. You can see where they are, and it's just really easy to just cut that section and paste it to there, cut and paste, and you can just block it along as you like, and you can make little changes. So rather than being stuck in this 1, 2, 3, or 4 bar loop, just going round and round and round, you can basically have that as long as you want. So you could, in fact, score out an entire, you know, Prokofiev symphony with all the percussion parts from beginning to end, because that is going to be the polar opposite to something like a hip-hop song, where it's just generally a 2-bar loop that just goes round and round and round and round and round and basically never changes. So you can do that in Logic if you want to get that complicated. Or if you still want to use it like a basic step sequencer, you can still just program in 1 bar, and in Logic or most other DAWs, you can just drag it out using the loop feature and just loop, and just drag it out for as long as you want it, and then copy and paste and create another one and put in your variations, and it's just all there for you to see. So for me, it's just much simpler. And with packages like Addictive Drums from XLN Audio, that's got a combination of great acoustic kits and fantastic real machines for the electronic kits as well. And then MODO Drums from IK Multimedia, that actually uses a fantastic modeled type thing. So it doesn't use samples, it uses a combination of modeling and sampling. So for all the drums, the kick, the snare, and the toms and all the percussion pieces, they are actually computer modeled. Now, the advantage of that is you can tune the drums up and down as much as you want, and it doesn't affect the timbre or the actual flavor, shall we say, of any particular drum. Whereas if you use samples, you can't really tune the drums up and down too much, because the further away you get from the original tuning that the recording was made from, it starts to sound a little bit funky and weird, and it just doesn't really have the right timbre anymore. But with the, like I said, with the MODO drums from IK Multimedia, because it's modeled, you can tune them up and down and manipulate them as much as you want, and they're still going to sound amazing. Now, when I say it's a combination of modeling and sampling, for the cymbals, they are actually a combination of model and sampling. So there's some coding in there, but there's a bit of sample too. And I think the reason they've done that is because everybody knows that modeling a hi-hat sound or a crash or a ride or a splash cymbal or a china or anything else, it's really difficult to try and get anything that sounds authentic. And, you know, you would have heard on this Arturia DrumBrute that the actual hi-hat setting, you know, the more, you know, for example, if you drive it here with this distortion button, you know, the further you push that, the hi-hat just starts to break up, and it basically has this horrible digital clipping thing that cuts in, and it just sounds really, really horrible. You know, that is another little negative of this as well. The actual, you know, for the Arturia DrumBrute, this particular drum machine, I found the distortion drive, you can't actually turn it up any more than the 9 o'clock position, so about 20% of the way. As soon as you go past that, and as soon as you get to halfway, it just starts to introduce all kinds of nasties and little bits of artifacting and distortion and clipping type sounds, and it's just not very pleasant. So with that, I never go more than about 20% of the way up when it is turned on. Again, with the software packages, you don't have those problems. And also, another advantage of using software is if you change your mind on a beat, then you can just literally grab it here and move it to where you want. You know, I can just grab all these and just, you know, move them and put them anywhere, and it's really easy to do. Whereas once you've actually made a recording from an actual drum machine DI'd into your audio interface and computer, you're left with this. You're basically left with a audio waveform, and you can't edit that. Well, I mean, there's a degree you can chop it up and move things around, but you can't actually change the actual sounds if you decided that you wanted something to be a tom instead of a snare, for example. So with the actual software, you've got scope to just change it in the future, in the same way that if you use a plugin for reverb, and you basically put something up on Spotify, if, you know, some years down the line, you'd change your mind, think, you know, it's too much reverb on that, you can just go back and then change it with the plugin. Whereas if you used a hardware reverb unit, that's baked into the sound and you can't change it. So that's another reason I prefer the software plugins. And for me personally, I'm not keen on the sound that the Arturia DrumBrute produces. I mean, you know, this isn't a diss for the Arturia. It's not a negative. It's just me personally. I don't like the sound it produces. It's not a 909. It's not an R8. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't really give those gut-wrenching deep bass notes for the kick. It's all kind of very honky sounding. You've got that sort of mid-range honky sound coming, even from the kick. So it doesn't have any real punch there. It's just all a little bit too lightweight. And, you know, the flavor and characteristic of it, it doesn't really do it for me personally. Again, that's not a diss for the Arturia. It's a great drum machine. It's just not for me personally. Some people might love it. And of course, you can always do a bit of post work on it to thicken up the bass with EQ if you wanted to do that anyway. And I also found there's only really one sound you can get out of it. Because of the analog synth engine that it's based on, you've only really got one sound. And by tweaking the knobs and controls, you've just basically got a little bit of variation, but not much. It's still, you know, you could basically tune this up any way you want and it will be recognizable as an Arturia DrumBrute Impact. And that's it. So there's not much scope for variation there. Again, it's not a negative. It is what it is. So yeah, there it is. I personally prefer using the software packages, and they just work for me. They sound just as good. There's no difference side by side. You can't hear the difference. They're just different flavors of each other, basically. So there we are. I hope you found this video interesting, and if you like this kind of content on music production equipment, recording techniques, or anything to do with photography, subscribe and watch out for future videos, because I'm uploading content like this on a regular basis. So until the next time, take it easy. Bye for now.